Many thanks to the organisers for the opportunity. I hope you've all you mathematics nuts out there have had your morning shot of formulas and stuff, because my talk's not going to have any of those in it. I'd just like to share with you some experiences from our National Centre of Excellence. So South Africa has a national program of centres of excellence. It's been running for about 13 years now, and our centre, the DST NRF National Centre of Excellence for Invasion Biology, was one of the first 5 or 6 centres that was launched. And I think it was a highly competitive process. And I think the fact that our Department of Science and Technology funded with substantial funding a centre on invasion biology in South Africa, which has many other issues, indicates the seriousness of the problem in South Africa. So I'd just like to introduce a few people in the front row here that I've brought along for support: Sabrina and John and Giovanni. I will speak to you a little bit later on specific issues. Sabrina will speak to you about risk assessment. So there's an emerging paradigm in invasion biology, invasion science. I'll speak about that in a while, to manage invasions within a risk paradigm. John is a frog expert on amphibians. He'll speak to us about frogs. And Giovanni is also a frog expert, but he's going to speak to you about one particularly interesting frog that's invading here in South Africa, and he's speak to you about some efforts to model its spread. So as I'm sure we all know, we're in what's known as the Anthropocene, where humans are dominating all aspects of our ecosystems, and the reshuffling of the Earth's biota is one of the features that's been said to characterize this new era that we find ourselves in, and the phenomenon of biological invasions has exploded over the last 50 years in particular. So this is quite I see part of this slide is sliced off, but anyway. So this image was drawn from a very famous book that was published in 1958 by Charles Elton, who is a professor of zoology at Oxford, and he wrote a book called The Ecology of Invasions by Animals and Plants. It was a popular book, but he spoke about the world's continents as tanks of water, which are connected by pipes. And and in the 1950s, invasions were not really a huge issue, but he connected what he saw happening around the world and put together a remarkably profound statement of the whole issue of invasions that he saw that was unfolding. So a lot of these examples here are examples that were mentioned in Elton's book in the 1950s and which have emerged or have become more important as poster children of the study of invasion biology. As I'm sure we all know, invasive species are widely held to be a major threat to the biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, along with habitat change and other factors. And we have every conceivable taxonomic group of organisms have been moved around, and some of these species in all groups have become naturalized or invasive and are affecting ecosystems in various ways. So our center would.
I may have missed. How would you define an invasive species?
Okay. I think there is a bit about that later. But how we define invasive species are those species that are moved outside of their natural dispersal range through human action. There are obviously many species that are range expanding species, but for a whole range of reasons, there are really good reasons to study and to think of those species that are moved by humans as a special category, because they're often moved without natural enemies, and their whole behavior and impacts are rather different. Is that adequate?
Well, I'll ask you more questions later, because the
Yeah.
time scales and things like that.
Sure. Please interrupt me at any time. So our center is predominantly, we are, as with all the other national centers of excellence, we're supposed to do world-class science. We're supposed to do capacity development. So in the almost 13 years of our existence, we've trained over 250 students at the master's, PhD level. We also host a whole lot of postdocs. Most of our work is focused on issues in South Africa. And South Africa is an interesting laboratory. We have a diversity of terrestrial biomes. We have a very interesting marine system with a warm current and a cold current, very productive ecosystem. We have interesting and diverse and productive freshwater ecosystems, rivers, lakes, and so on. We have a good network of protected areas, so we're able to study how natural ecosystems and invasive species work in natural ecosystems and a range of other ecosystems with various levels of human influence. And we've also got a diverse human society in South Africa, ranging from extreme poverty to affluence and everything in between. We have pockets of first world society, and we have pockets of third world society, and people throughout South Africa perceive ecosystems, they perceive invasive and introduced species in a range of ways, which affects how we can approach management of this problem. So this is a list, I mean, of some of the introduced and invasive species in South Africa, those that have been recorded in terrestrial, freshwater, and marine ecosystems. So these are the known, a few years ago, the recorded numbers of introduced or alien species. So alien means simply introduced through human action, and invasive species are those species that are human introduced but spread. So we have a wide range of problems, unfortunately, but also fortunately for us who are interested in the science of invasive species. We have more than enough to work on. So in particular, we have special invasions in some categories, and this is the group of organisms that I've done most of my own research on trees. South Africa has got quite a small area of natural forest. So in the early years, hundreds of species of trees were introduced for forestry and for a range of other purposes. 80 species of eucalyptus have been introduced into South Africa, 60 species of the pines, 80 species of acacia. Many of these species have got long residence time in South Africa and have been moved around over large areas. And this presents a very interesting natural experiment. Many of these species have become really widespread and serious invaders. We also have a world famous management initiative called Working for Water, which was launched at the end of when apartheid was abolished and the new government took over. There was an opportunity to provide employment, or a need to have employment for a large number of unemployed and unskilled people. So Working for Water employs many thousands of the people to clear these invasive species, thereby providing employment, but also addressing an environmental issue. We also have progressive legislation in the form of our so-called Biodiversity Act. By no means perfect. There are a lot of flaws in this legislation that make it really hard to implement, but it's a really good start. It's important to note that the pathways whereby these species that we have as invasive species in South Africa have arrived in a range of ways, what we call pathways, intentional and accidental pathways, and it's important for us to understand when studying these invasions and working out ways of managing them, that the importance of these pathways is not static over time. So for instance, in the marine ecosystems, ballast water is a relatively recent innovation through ships that need large amounts of water to stabilize them when they have no load on. So this pathway has emerged as a really important one, whereas some other pathways like the fur trade has declined largely. Mariculture is another one that's exploded. The use of growing marine organisms for food, and we need to understand these pathways and predict how they will change over time in order to have any chance of managing them effectively. So there's been a lot of work done in South Africa and internationally. This was a paper that we published a few years ago on trying to understand the importance of dispersal pathways in determining the success of introduced species in establishing, and also the evolutionary success of the whole invasion phenomenon. So this is the graph that shows the typical pattern of a biological invasion. A species arrives in a new area over here, and almost all species have a pronounced lag phase when there's not much population growth or spread, and then after some time, it might be a few years, it might be decades, a century or more, we lead into a period of exponential spread which finally ends when all invasible habitat or most invasible habitat is occupied. And we need to understand processes, mechanisms that operate at all of these stages in order to understand what sort of invasive species we have, but also we need to implement management at all of these stages. So this graph shows the wide range of disciplines and fields that we as invasion scientists work on. And in the early years, until about 30 years ago or so, the phenomenon of invasive species was studied mainly as a biological phenomenon. So people were interested in biological aspects of invasions. As invasions have become more widespread and pervasive in our ecosystems, there's been a need to address a whole range of other things like policy, resource economics, risk analysis, sociology, vector science, how the species are moved around. So this was called invasion biology or invasion ecology, but now we actually refer to this whole body of endeavor as invasion science, and it's becoming more and more an interdisciplinarity and interdisciplinary field where we're interested in things like ethics, risk, and so on, and we'll hear some more about that later. So we've seen this invasion graph here, and this is a scheme that we use at the CIB, at the Center for Invasion Biology, to identify priorities for research. So we're interested in understanding and developing management based on what we see around us. So we need to understand invasion patterns and processes, and these are the things that relate to each of these stages. We also need to address the so what. We can understand biological, ecological phenomena until the end of time, and that does not ensure that we'll have the ability to manage them. So we really need to do a lot of work in the so what. And we at the CIB, I see it's sliced off something at the end there again, but so we need to do work in all of these fields, and we need these sort of overarching fields of study as well. We need to understand the biological foundations of the ecosystems we're interested in. We need to understand human dimensions, why species are introduced, how people perceive them, the opportunities for management. We need to develop ways to inventorize invasive species. We need mathematics and modeling ability, and we need advanced ways of bringing this all together in a policy. And a few years ago, our center was one of the leading drafters of a draft, unfortunately not published yet, but still on the minister's desk, but a national strategy for invasive species. So in the next few minutes, I'm just gonna flash through a few of the things that we've been involved in the last year or so, and I've picked a few areas just to show the range of areas where we do research. So the first one is species introduction pathways and risk assessment. I've shown this before. Understanding these pathways, and this picture sort of summarizes what things are now and how they've changed in the past. But we need to sort of look forward and try and understand how these pathways might change over time. And it's not an easy task. So there has been a lot of work done conceptualizing the various ways that species are moved around the world intentionally and accidentally or unintentionally through various pathways and the implications for these and these various slots and need to be really well understood and built into management considerations. I'm going to skip that one. A few years ago, or a year or two back, Sabrina and a few of us, we were working on arthropods, and these are a few of the less conventional reasons why arthropods are moved around the world. We all know that insects and other arthropods are introduced for the biocontrol and other purposes, but butterflies are often now used in weddings. Many of these species that are used in the weddings are introduced species. Insects are becoming more popular in many parts of the world as pets, for human food. In medicine, there's a whole range of uses of arthropods, insects and other animals, silkworms for animal feed. So we try to. I'm not sure why this is half of this is off the screen here, but anyway. So this just goes to emphasize that pathways, the reasons for introduction, be it intentional or accidental, are always changing, and we need to understand these. We need to model these and continuously update our policies to make sure that we're managing for all these new ways that the species are moved around the world. And for a few of these new reasons why species are being moved, and I've just pulled out a few. Bioweapons is an interesting one. Pollination, medicinal use, pet trade. Each of these reasons for new pathways has major implications. So it influences how many of the organisms are introduced in terms of the colonization pressure, propagule pressure, the likelihood that the introduced organisms will escape into ecosystems, and how easy it is, if they did escape, how easy it is to manage them. Another field that I've been working on a lot is biofuels. As I'm sure you all know, there's a lot of interest in using plants to produce biodiesel and ethanol. In most cases, the plants that are identified as potential biofuel plants are alien plants. Many of them have many of the attributes that are associated with weediness or invasiveness, fast growth, wide habitat preferences, and so on. And around the world, there's been a lot of work on trying to link usefulness for biofuels with invasiveness, and trying to flesh out some pragmatic opportunities for using suitable plants, but reducing the impact of the species for as invasions. So this is a species which some of you might know. It's been widely heralded as a wonder plant for the biofuel. It's already planted in a few parts of Africa. It's got some of its relatives are known to be highly invasive, and it's got all the attributes: fast growth. So we've done quite a bit of work in trying to understand that if this species was widely used in South Africa, and it is mentioned in South Africa's biofuel policy, what the implications might be. So we've run all sorts of scenarios and so on, and we try to understand how various uses of this or other plants might influence the ability of the species to overcome certain barriers en route to becoming invasive. And we reckon that if it was used and widely planted in orchards or plantations for the biofuels, it would overcome the geographical barrier, the environmental barrier, and the reproductive barrier, and which means that managers would have to implement actions to prevent it from dispersing, from having environmental impact in disturbed and natural ecosystems. And we've sketched a few requirements and opportunities with respect to early detection, rapid response, and long-term management. Another species we're interested in a lot is a bamboo. It's also used for the biofuels, for ethanol, but more widely for other purposes, such as for construction, material, for restoration, for the carbon sequestration, and for other reasons. Widely planted around the world, wide range of products from beer to the bicycles and everything in between. It is already in South Africa. This is not a clear map, but South Africa, and these are locations where we know that there are already plantings, and in some areas it's already spreading from plantings. And these are a few of the initiatives, the funded projects that are unfolding in South Africa to introduce more species of bamboo, to plant more areas with bamboo. So we've a student of mine has been working on a global assessment to understand the global history of how bamboos have been moved around the world, for what purposes, over which time periods, how they've been planted. So this is the natural range of bamboos, areas where it's been introduced to, and areas where it's become invasive. And we've looked at a range of studies in each of these areas that help us to explain the biology of the species, that make it suitable and of interest to people to move around the world, and the attributes that enable it to become naturalized or invasive. And of 1,400 species of bamboo, we have evidence for 187 that have been moved outside of their native range. So far, only 9 species are classified in various parts of the world as being invasive, and there's an intermediate number that are that reproduce and are slightly weedy, but are not yet classified as invasive. And we've looked at things like the provenance, where they're introduced from, various growth forms, and subtribe, the position in the family. I don't need to spend much time on this, other than to say, until now, invasive species are largely from Asia and the Paleotropics, and belong to certain parts of the phylogeny. So these are the bad news species in these genera, and it's interesting that many of the species that have been widely used and introduced have got multiple have been bred for various purposes. So there's a wide range of forms of the species, and the number of forms that have been bred is also positively linked with the number of invasiveness in those species. And there are also certain attributes of the species, like the thickness of the bamboo, that make it useful and therefore moved around. So all of these help us to produce initial risk assessments to feed into local policies. If species with certain attributes are introduced and widely used in the bamboo industry, we should expect invasions. Okay, and the next issue that I'm going to speak about is expansion and spread. So this is a widely used model which conceptualizes how a species, if it's introduced by humans over a geographical barrier, has to overcome a series of other barriers in order to emerge at the other end as being invasive. And a lot of work has been done in our center and worldwide to understand the mechanisms and the processes that operate at various places of this diagram to either facilitate or to halt or mediate invasions. And an area that we've been interested in the last while is something called invasion debt. And we were worried that a lot of the management of invasive species is focused on those species that are already invasive. But we have seen that many species, if not most species, have this lag phase. So in all parts of the world, species already introduced, sometimes already widely planted or used in aquaculture or mariculture, are virtually sure to become invasive over time. So we developed a few components of invasion debt: the introduction debt, the establishment debt, the spread debt, and the impact debt, which link to these various areas of invasion. And these are how. Okay, so invasion debt, which is sort of similar. You might have heard of the term extinction debt, whereby a lot of the impacts on native species worldwide are in progress and haven't yet played out, and will get worse over time. So invasion debt is the additional amount of invasion that could take place in a region in the future. And these are the these are the actors waiting in the wings, which will almost certainly be our invasive species in the next few years, decades, centuries. and these are the four categories or four components of invasion debt, and we've parameterized these. I had to add a few formula here, and we use these. We've used this idea in a few applications, but most prominently for acacias in South Africa and worldwide. So as I said, acacias, there are about 80 species that have been introduced, most of them more than 150 years ago. And if we plot the invaded area on this axis and the potential area, so we see that some species have invaded huge areas, but have invaded almost all of their suitable area. On the other side, and these are the species that we are particularly interested in. They've been there for a long time, have a large invasion debt or large opportunity to invade large areas, but have only invaded small areas. And this, in mapping out these sort of species, we've been able to identify a few species. This is Acacia paradoxa, and this is Acacia implexa. And to undertake fairly detailed studies on these species and to develop eradication plans. Both of these species have it emerged that eradication, which is the elimination of the species from a region, is a feasible option and has been set into motion. How's my time doing? Okay. So another area of interest is impact. Obviously, not all.
Sorry, Dave, you actually have till 10:50, so you have.
Because you asked for 90
Yeah, you have 45 minutes.
Oh, wow, I can relax, have some water. Right, so not all invasive species, not all alien species are invasive, and not all invasive species have the same level of impact. And because there are so many invasive species worldwide, we need to prioritize and focus on managing preventative management and all other forms of management on those species that have the worst impact. So there's a huge literature now that is exploring impact from every conceivable idea, from every conceivable perspective. So a few of us at the center. So what are the problems with this? Until recently, there was no standard framework or metrics for assessing and describing impact, even within particular taxonomic groups, let alone between groups. And there's often been sort of a conflict of interest between what some people see as a positive impact and other people see as negative impact. There's a divide between what are classified as environmental impacts versus economic impacts. Often, negative impacts are linked with environmental impacts, whereas positive impacts are seen by some sectors of society as having economic benefits. Impacts are often assessed and publications written over short periods of time. So normal master's or a PhD study is 3 or 4 years, whereas the actual impact of an invasive species might take much longer than that to happen and to be manifested. There's a marked lack of experimental evidence for impact. Most studies of impact look at before and after, or have a look at invaded versus non-invaded habitats and infer impact. Experiments to show this are expensive and will take a lot of time and are often not entirely practical. Also, each impact is specific to a region or a particular sector of society. An impact of a species here in South Africa might be viewed and conceptualized and parameterized very differently to the same species invading in some other part of the world. And unfortunately, there have been arguments in the literature about this, which are confusing the public as well. So, which hasn't been very helpful. So, a few of us in the last few years, and I think Sabrina will also have this slide probably. So we were a working group that was aiming to produce a scheme for classifying impact along the same lines as the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, how they classified red-listed species, those species that are vulnerable to extinction. So this is how the IUCN red list works, whereas species are classified as extinct. If there's adequate data, species are extinct in the wild, and various categories of endangerment and less severe, and so on. So this scheme is widely used internationally to sort of prioritize action for conserving rare species of biodiversity. So this is a scheme that we compiled, which is very similar. As you can see, if there's adequate information on the impact of a species, you can classify the impact using objective, and I'll discuss that a little bit later. You can classify the impact as massive, major, moderate, minor, or minimal. And there's also a group of classifications where there's inadequate data and where it's impossible to actually use these categories. So this is an example of an impact class and how we would classify an impact as massive, major, moderate, and so on. So for instance, if you're interested in the impact of invasive species in intensifying competition with natives, you would massive impact would be one that resulted in replacement or local extinction of one or more native species, or changes in community structure that are irreversible. And there are similar ways of classifying the other things. So this provides quite a useful way, and in a recent publication we put forward a more user-friendly flow chart of how you would apply this in practice to arrive at uniform and agreed upon classifications. And this scheme will hopefully be widely adopted and will certainly help us to agree on which of those invasive species that really demand priority action. So if any of you are interested, that's a publication. And there's a huge opportunity for mathematical inputs into this whole scheme. Okay. Removal of species. This is Cape Town. We are around here somewhere behind the mountain. As I'm sure you all know, it's a wonderful city with a national park right in the heart of the city. A lot of natural area and a lot of human settlement all around. Largely, the lowlands are largely are transformed. A lot of natural area and a large interface between wildlands and urban ecosystems. So we've been working with the city in developing a scheme for objectively classifying alien species, invasive species, to help them prioritize those species which needs some form of intervention. And we have a wide range of species from trees which are invasive and have a wide range of ecosystem impacts, but also are useful for fuel wood. We have certain wild introduced animals like squirrels, which some people like a lot, but do have impacts. We have water weeds that clog up a lot of the rivers and that need expensive intervention. We have many species that affect fire hazard. We have some wild animals like the tars. So we have trees which people like to picnic under, but which have impacts on biodiversity. So we developed this flow chart which helped us to identify species in various categories. So we've plotted on this axis the potential for significant negative impact, and on this axis the benefits. And these are the species that have high impact and relatively low benefit. And these are those species which most people in society will agree that there's a need to manage and reduce. On the other side, we have a group of species with low impact and high benefit, and these are those which most people will argue leave them. No need to activate expensive management. Importantly, though, that there's a group in the middle here that have high impact and high benefit, and these are the species that result in substantial conflicts of interest and involve very time-consuming engagement with stakeholders, where to manage them, how to manage them. So these are the problem ones that need active stakeholder engagement. Okay, my final example sort of links to this on how we deal with conflicts of interest. And an area that I've been involved in a lot of my research is species that are used for forestry, and this is Pinus radiata, not far from here, introduced from North America. A wonderful tree for forestry, but unfortunately highly invasive. So this is the one area where the invasions have been fairly well managed, but almost everywhere else where this species was planted, you'll see invasive trees moving off into the natural ecosystems. And again, we engaging with forestry here to identify those species that have high benefits and have high impacts. And Pinus radiata falls really firmly in this part of this space here. And we've worked with forestry and stakeholders to agree on how this problem has unfolded over time. So Pinus radiata was introduced in the 1850s and was initially only beneficial. So it was planted. Revenue from forestry was beneficial. However, the extent of invasions increased. These invasive stands used a lot of water in mountain catchment areas, influenced fire regime, had an impact on biodiversity. And the net benefits of this introduced species have declined over time. And it's at some stage there is an argument that we can make that the harmful impacts of this species exceed the benefits, and that management is seriously needed to push this line up in some way. And we've done similar exercises. This is of a pine one, but with acacias, with prosopis, which is often used as a miniature tree and for forage in rangelands, for eucalyptus, another forestry species. So we've sat with the stakeholders and sort of populated this graph, and seeking ways, firstly, to agree on the dimensions of the problem, and secondly, to identify and to brainstorm opportunities for win-win solutions if those exist. If there are no win-win solutions, we have to identify solutions that are in the interest of the country. So through this exercise with forestry, but we've also worked in similar exercises with the pet trade. Many species of reptiles and mammals are introduced for the pets, the birds, and we've developed sort of a rule of how to engage with stakeholders to flesh out all of the issues and to hopefully move forward. And I don't need to read all of these, but an issue that we were surprised with was making sure that that all of the stakeholders actually understand each other's perceptions, and this has been an interesting exercise. Okay, so this was just a short example, a few examples of some of the issues that we've been working in. Where do we head from here? I think we are convinced that we need invasion science that draws in biologists, mathematicians, epidemiologists, ethicists, sociologists, economists to understand all aspects of the problem. We have a good working national program, the Natural Resources Management Program, and the Working for Water team. Many issues with this, but it has the structure for being the overarching management agency for incorporating a lot of the measures that we've developed over the years. As I said before, legislation is a key part of managing invasions. We have a Biodiversity Act, which is by no means perfect. There are moves to revise this and have a Biological Invasions Act, which will hopefully happen in a few years from now. We have a draft national strategy, which, if signed into being and if implemented, would be the instrument whereby the legislation and all the evidence from science is merged into an action plan. And we need to deal with things like conflict of interest in new ways, in new and open ways, to make sure that stakeholders are not pulling in opposite directions. And this is invasion science. It's a really exciting area to be in. Lots of opportunities for collaborations. And it's in this middle ground where I think there are endless opportunities for mathematics to really help us to understand and parameterize and model a lot of the things that I've mentioned earlier. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, we have time for questions and discussion. Thank you for the talk. Yeah.
Can I go back to my original question about the definition?
Sure.
So I'm trying to. Sorry, this is talk.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, in terms of the timescale for species to be considered entrenched in an area and then part of the biome, because I'm just trying to understand, you talked about species, clearly first have to be aliens so that can be introduced by humans. But the question is again, when did that introduction take place?
Maybe I could ask you to explain why is that of interest to you?
Pardon?
Why is that of interest to you?
Well, because I'm trying to understand the concept of an invasive species.
Okay, so species evolve in isolation, and they develop their own associated biota of enemies and mutualists, pollinators and seed dispersers. If humans and obviously species have been moving around the earth ever since life began. However, if they move on their own, they move along with their natural enemies and their pollinators and seed dispersers. However, if humans move a bunch of seeds from Australia into South Africa, what happens is they leave behind some crucial natural enemies that regulate the population growth, and that's why we get this explosive proliferation of acacias in our fynbos. So, and I know that there are some people that ask us, and they say that trout were introduced more than 100 years ago. Surely they are now native. And my answer would be evolution hasn't worked like that in hundreds of years. It works in millions of years. So there's no argument that a trout, although it's been here 100 years, is any less of an alien, an introduced species than it was a year after it arrived.
So it's really relative to evolution timescales that you're looking at invasion.
Yeah.
That's really what I was trying to get.
So, thank you. This lecture has been very interesting. I think I'm getting to know more about how it works in your area. But I want to ask, you see, there is this problem that comes with this invasion, which is the management at the end time, where it's spreading rapidly. I don't know if you have control measures in place that checks the sporadic spread before it gets to that last stage.
Absolutely.
Because if that is done, maybe we may never get to the other stage.
Sure. That's
okay, maybe answer that. There's one other thing. You see, I do think that bringing invasive species introduced into an environment, there's kind of some limitations to it. For example, if I want to take something from South Africa to Nigeria, maybe there may be a lot of other things I have to consider. Maybe the climate, the region, whatever, and if it's going to do that. I don't know, is there anything you do here that whatever you do survives where you intend to introduce it?
Could you repeat the question?
Okay, the first one had to do with management of invasions. Is it best to manage invasions early on? Is that correct? Okay, so there's very clear evidence that many invasions or all invasions, it's most effective to manage them early on, and in many cases after the species has spread over a large area, management simply becomes an effort to reduce impacts and extent. So in many parts of the world, in South Africa as well, we have a invasive species program which focuses on species at the early stage of invasion. Where we undertake assessments is eradication, the elimination of the species from the area. Is it feasible? And Sabrina works for that program, so she might be able to add some more. But I know they have undertaken very detailed feasibility assessments for the eradication of certain species, and some species that they think it is possible to eradicate them with enough expenditure over a long time, and the actions have been set in motion. For other species, the conclusion that was arrived on was it's not feasible. The population is too widespread or abundant, and that we have to do other things, like, for instance, introduce biocontrol. South Africa's got a good history of introducing insects and other organisms from the native range, which help to reduce the fecundity of the species. And the other question you asked had to do with how do we predict if a species will become invasive. And there's a lot of work on that. The screening protocols that use things like climate. Is there a strong match between the climate in the original range and the new range, and other things like that? But yeah, climate is a very important one.
We have a question over here.
Thank you so much for the presentation, and I just want to comment on your presentation. I'm into socioeconomic forestry, and this is a very interesting presentation for me. I really love your presentation. I'm starting from the point where you try to differentiate between alien and invasive, and I really love the definition you gave that it's possible for a species to be alien and not invasive.
Sure.
And that is very interesting. And a lot of scientists tends to look at the negative aspect of invasive species. And it's recently, we in socioeconomists try to look at what are the economic contributions of invasive species to local communities.
Mm.
It may be possible that a species is invasive and the locals may be using the species for even maybe some other benefits.
Sure.
Of which most of your research have been able to prove this morning. And one thing I just want to say is try to introduce a species into an area, as Riley mentioned out. A lot of impacts have been assessed. But at what point can we be able to weigh the negative over the maybe the positive impact of any invasive species? Because if you get to it's relative to an area.
Mm.
It could be a blessing in disguise in an area, whereas in some area another man's food may be another man's poison.
Of course.
So at what point can we be able to weigh that a negative over the positive, or the positive over the negative of any invasive or maybe alien species in an area?
Okay, so I don't think I need to repeat that. It was quite clear. How can we relate the positive impacts of invasions to the negative ones? And there has been a lot of work on that. The big problem is expressing impact in the same currency, and many attempts have been made to use financial rand or dollars, and there has been some work done this on a forestry species in South Africa, black wattle, which you might know, Acacia mearnsii, was introduced in the 1850s for forestry. It's beneficial species, but it's the most widespread invasive species in South Africa and has huge impact. And there was a very detailed economic study done, which had a look at all the benefits from the forestry, including downstream and spin-off impacts, as well as drawing in a wide range of impacts, positive impacts, use by the local communities for firewood, for shelter, medicine, animals for browsing, and some will argue that it's never possible to convert all of those less financial things into hard currency. But that analysis found that that the impacts of this species were substantially more than the forestry benefits.
There's a question in the middle there.
Yes. You mentioned that the invasive species go through the large, rapid, and big population. At what point at what point is it really destructive to the native population?
Yeah, so we heard that invasions often undergo this lag phase and then an exponential increase. At what stage does impact really begin? And that's very different for among species. Most species, I would say, impact is strongly related to the distribution and the abundance. But there are some examples of introduced species that have an impact from right at the beginning. And an example that we've been thinking about recently in the city here is a tree called Ailanthus alticissima. It's called a tree of heaven, and this species it produces pollen that's many people are already allergic to. So this one, even if it's a single tree, not even invasive yet, it can have impact over large areas. That's not so closely linked to the abundance and range of the species.
Thank you very much for this enlightenment. Mine is more concerned on the enabling environment in which this negativity versus positivity. South Africa seems to be more strengthened in terms of the legal regimes about this invasive biological information. Whereas in other countries, you find that issues to do with biological invasion are embedded within research institutional organizations. And so at the strategic level, politics, they don't consider it to be so much. Is it possible now that we need to understand it deeply, that South Africa could move this at the higher level into African Union, so that we move at the same level of how to address this? Because last year I was doing a catchment management plan. The issues that we are raising here were emerging, that some communities, for example, where they lack firewood, you find they prefer to have the pines. And in highland areas, actually pines and eucalyptus are a very big problem, whereas they are planted to stabilize the slopes. But they generate a lot of water, storm water, which eventuate into creeping soils, landslides, name them, to the downstream. And so if there is no hazard eventually, the government never comes out to be concerned. But if you do the impact studies, actually most of the impact studies come up with negativity and how to mitigate it. But most of this business is done by the multinational companies. And that's where the problem is coming from, of the invasion. So bringing together the multinational business institutions to discuss this would be very ideal in managing the biological invasion. That's my proposal. If you can start.
Yeah, I think there's a huge need for that in Africa to interact and collaborate. And I think we need to move towards where.
You need to speak up a bit for people at the back. There's quite a lot of noise.
Yeah, I think there's a real need to develop a sort of an environmental management ethic worldwide that's based on risk assessment, objective assessments of risks, not only for invasions, but for all all environmental issues. Many other environmental issues that have the same problems as we have here, with the benefits and the impacts, and we need to have a framework and a platform that enables the objective assessment of these risks to be made, involving all stakeholders. So we for instance, we've started off a few interactions with CABI in Nairobi to produce some sort of guidelines for species for which we have some knowledge here.
So I was interested in your expansion of invasion biology from a biological subject to something that involves human interactions and management and conflict resolution. And my perception is that the mathematics applied to invasion has often been on the biological side.
Exactly.
And I was wondering if you could venture what areas of mathematics might be the most useful for this expanded envelope. What do we need, game theory, or do we need economics, or bio? I'll let you say.
Well, I mean, I think there's endless opportunities. The one that I'm excited in, and I've held some discussions with Kang Hui, who some of you might know, is using network theory. Network theory to have a look at stakeholders, how stakeholders see and interact regarding issues around invasions, and there are many ways how they get benefits from various facets of an introduced species, how they, what language they use in communicating, what currency they use when debating these issues. I think there's a lot of opportunities to see, is there a solution to these networks whereby we get a win-win solution, or is it so that in some cases no win-win solution exists, and that you have to make a decision that will benefit some stakeholders and not others. Obviously, in modelling of spread, so that's more the biological side. But in how humans are implicated in that, in some non-intuitive ways, I think we need to really increase the complexity and the dimensions of our models to mirror the complexity of some of our pathways. And again, not just using those models to identify what's happened in the past, but to show, for instance, using sensitivity analysis and stuff, where interventions might be most effectively used.
Thank you.
Just a quick comment, please. When you're trying to look at the benefits and the impact, there's a recent observation I made in Nigeria concerning this species, as the director indicated, the name,
Yep.
using controlling desertification and this and Sahelian and all these land features. And I discovered when I traveled to the north that this species was used in controlling desert, but recently it's becoming very invasive.
Yeah.
And it's spreading very wide. And people were seeing it as their effort being yielding positive, and the tree is actually spreading, but it's becoming more of invasive. But well, it's doing the work of preventing desert. Well, then the other one you mentioned is this jatropha.
Yes.
the Jatrophococcus, is being planted. Is it being planted in South Africa?
Only on an experimental scale until now.
Because
So not.
I don't know. Maybe is it invasive?
I don't think there's much evidence to show that species is invasive yet. It hasn't been widely planted. There are some of its relatives in the same genus that have been widely used and are highly invasive, which leads us to wave some red flags. Invasiveness often takes a long time to. Many of these species are showed prosopis, which was used. I'm sure it's in Nigeria as well. It was introduced in South Africa and many other species as a wonder plant. It's going to solve problems everywhere. There's nobody even thought of it becoming a huge weed.
There's one more question over here.
Obviously, for invasive species, the climate change is making an impact. Have you noticed that in your records with regards to data collection, how this has impacted, for example, shortening that lag phase before the species get entrenched and expanded?
No, I cannot say that we have any hard evidence for that. Although I've got no doubt that it will be a factor in affecting the invasion debt. And another thing is that in screening species for invasiveness, one of the most widely used metrics is, has a species been invasive elsewhere? And so this relies on experiments that have happened in other parts of the world. However, with climate change, I think a lot of those experiments are going to become less useful because of the changing climate.
There's ample room for modeling, then, presumably.
Oh yes, for sure.
Okay, well, let's thank you.
Thanks.